Russia, Krasnoyarsk, 1997. The city was hit by a wave of brutal and senseless crimes. Housewives, taxi drivers, summer residents, women alone on deserted streets. Anyone could become a victim of the elusive and cunning maniac. The police questioned the few survivors in vain and searched for the suspect. The maniac was elusive. You're watching Strashnota, and today's case is about how sheer mediocrity combined with excessive narcissism and a thirst for recognition can lead to terrible consequences. I'll leave additional materials in Telegram at the link below the video. Also, subscribe to Boosty and Patreon. I'll use them as backup platforms when everything else eventually gets blocked. Aleksandr Nikolaevich Vasiliev was born on March 31st, 1950, in a large family in the village of Malinovka, Chuvash, ASSR. His parents were ordinary workers. In 1965, the family moved to Krasnoyarsk. Aleksandr did not stand out among his peers and was an average student. He didn't have any special talents, but he really loved to brag. He made up tall tales and talked about achievements that didn't exist. But he also played the role of a hero masterfully. People listened to him with their mouths open, but when the lies came to light, Sasha was often laughed at and sometimes even beaten up. No one wanted to be friends with the arrogant and self-absorbed teenager, and he wasn't included in any group. And his parents had no time for him at all. After graduating from school number 9 in the Solnekhnogorsk district of Krasnoyarsk, Aleksandr received a diploma with nothing but Cs. Then he entered a vocational school and trained to become a tractor mechanic and driver. He rarely showed up for classes, but the teachers still managed to give him passing grades. At 18, Aleksandr got married and they had 2 children. At first glance, it was an ordinary, unremarkable family. But Aleksandr Vasilyev had one passion. Passion in the literal sense. He really loved looking at adult materials. His wife turned a blind eye to it until one incident happened that changed everything fundamentally. His 5-year-old daughter Katya had some friends over, little girls. They played, laughed, and had fun. Aleksandr sat down with them and suddenly suggested they look at some photos, but they were not suitable for children at all. The children, not understanding anything, started asking what was happening, and he gladly explained, even putting one of the girls on his lap. His wife came back from work, saw and heard all of this, and interpreted it unambiguously. Aleksandr tried to explain himself in vain. The next day, she filed a report against her husband. Aleksandr was arrested and charged with molestation. That's how Vasiliev received a prison sentence for a very shameful charge. Children become outcasts and belong to the lowest caste. They are humiliated and subjected to forced sexual acts throughout their entire sentence. During his time in prison, his wife never visited him, nor did she send him a single package. Vasiliev was released from prison after 3 years with a broken psyche and resentment towards the whole world. By that time, his wife had filed for divorce and left Krasnoyarsk with the children. He had to start his life over again. The article under which Aleksandr was serving his sentence was not among the serious ones. That's why Vasiliev was hired as a driver of a Kamaz truck at a combine harvester factory. He worked and lived quietly and peacefully. A dull, unremarkable man. An ordinary, average person. But he wanted people to talk about him, for newspapers to write about him, for TV shows to be made about him. He wanted popularity and fame, and TikTok, well, it didn't exist back then. But he wanted fame at any cost. Over a bottle with a fellow soldier, he used to say that he would definitely become famous. But they just laughed and told them not to pour him anymore. Soon the factory went bankrupt and Aleksandr was left without a job. Like many people at that time, Vasiliev went to the market, to trade. But either he didn't have a knack for business, or luck was fickle with him again. In any case, business was bad. On top of that, one day he was robbed. A batch of goods was stolen, the one he had invested all his money in. And his anger at the world flared up with renewed force. One day, Aleksandr heard a philosophical theory on TV. It turns out that people are divided into superhumans, who are allowed to do anything, and everyone else, who are allowed nothing. The theory was fiercely criticized, and people tried to prove the opposite. But he liked it. And Vasiliev decided that he, of course, belonged to those very superhumans. He was exactly that kind of superhuman. And if that's the case, then he can do whatever he wants. And he doesn't have to ask anyone for permission. And his conscience is clear because he's not like everyone else, he's chosen. In short, the answer to the question of whether I am a trembling creature or have the right was found. And Aleksandr was ready to prove it to the whole world. At the kiosk, he bought the first classifieds newspaper he saw and began to read it carefully. A mink coat, excellent. The owner is clearly not poor. He circled the phone number and went outside. From a payphone, a public phone on the street, he called and arranged a meeting. The Solnechny microdistrict in Krasnoyarsk. In the afternoon, the phone rang. A middle-aged woman with bright red hair and large brown eyes opened the door. A neat man was standing on the doorstep. He greeted her politely and introduced himself as a buyer. Vera Statsuk let him in and led him to the room. Vasiliev looked around. Well, they live pretty well. He listened closely. It's quiet in the rooms. So, that means there's no one here except the landlady. She already took the fur coat out of the closet. But how will you try it on? She asked, pausing for a second. It's a gift for my wife. She's about your size. He blurted out the answer he had prepared in advance. A birthday surprise. And after inspecting the fur coat from all sides, he asked to have it wrapped so it wouldn't accidentally get dirty. Vera turned away, wrapping the almost sold item in a bag, and Vasiliev pulled a lead rod out of his jacket pocket and struck Vera on the head with full force. The woman screamed and collapsed to the floor. Blood was running down her hair. Vasiliev smirked and walked leisurely to the cupboard as if he owned the place. Opening the doors, he rummaged through the contents. He took out all the drawers from the dresser. He found what he was looking for. A jewelry box hidden behind a pile of laundry. He grabbed the VCR and tapes from the table. Then he went out into the hallway and took the leather coat. Suddenly he stopped. A quiet child's cry came from the room. He rushed in there. A girl of about 5 stood near the woman crying. With sleepy eyes, she looked at him fearfully. Then at her mother lying face down. Vasiliev picked up the child. He looked gently into her eyes. Something from the past came to his mind at that moment. But a lot of time had already passed. He had to leave. He sat the little girl on the couch and said, "Don't cry, everything is fine. Mom is just tired." The child calmed down and he covered the little one with a blanket. He gathered his things and hurried out. A few hours later, the husband returned. The apartment was dark. He switched on the room light. His legs gave way. In the middle of the scattered things lay his wife, covered in blood. And on the couch, afraid to come out from under the blanket draped over her, his daughter was sobbing. He stood up. On shaky legs, he walked to the hallway to the phone. The ambulance and the police arrived quickly. Vera Statsuk miraculously survived. Doctors literally brought the young woman back from the brink of death. But the woman didn't know the first or last name of the criminal. She described his appearance but didn't remember anything distinctive. An ordinary man, there are thousands like him in the city. The investigators started searching, but finding a person in a big city is no easy task. And Vasiliev, encouraged by his first success, sold the items cheaply to fences and lived off that money without a care for several months. But then the money ran out. Once again he had a newspaper in his hands, and there it was, the ad he needed. Garage for sale. On April 9, 1997, he called the number from the ad using a payphone. The talkative owner, Frida Wagner, said that the garage was solid and left by her late husband, and she's selling it because she's moving to Germany with her son. He had just left to take care of the paperwork. Vasiliev arranged to come to her house and they would go together to see the garage. From the doorway he made sure the owner was there and asked for a glass of water. When the woman went to the kitchen, he rushed after her and struck her on the head with the same lead rod. This time, in addition to money and jewelry, he also got some antiques. And in the refrigerator there was sausage, cheese, and hot dogs. He took those too, no sense letting good food go to waste. In the evening, the son discovered his mother's body. The police saw a similar bag, the same pattern. Again, a woman, a robbery, and a smashed head. The neighbors didn't hear any suspicious noises. That means the criminal or criminals entered the apartment with the owner's consent. One of the police officers noticed a newspaper with classified ads on the table. They recalled the recent case of Vera Statsuk. That's when they realized that both women had placed an ad. The criminal most likely posed as a buyer. That's how he got into the homes of unsuspecting victims. The investigation combined the cases. And the area where the crimes were committed was the same, Solnechnogorsky. An article about the burglar was published in the local newspaper. Residents were asked to be cautious when selling personal belongings. After that, the crime stopped for a while, but Vasiliev did not go underground. He simply changed his tactics. On an autumn evening in the Solnechnogorsk district, in the suburbs of Krasnoyarsk, Vyacheslav stopped by the roadside. A man who was well dressed flagged him down, smiling in a friendly way, with an open look. "Boss, can you give me a ride to my dacha? It's not far, about 15 kilometers, he asked. Vyacheslav named the price, and the man, after thinking for a second, agreed. On the way, he mentioned his girlfriend waiting at the dacha and looked forward to seeing her. Vyacheslav stopped at his request in a small grove. The man didn't enter the village. He said he wanted to pick the last autumn flowers for his beloved at the edge of the forest. The stranger went out to the edge of the forest and suddenly cried out, "Look, someone is lying here," he said to the driver in a trembling voice. "Go take a look." Vyacheslav got out of the car and came closer. The stranger pointed toward the forest. Vyacheslav tried to see, but he saw nothing. A second later, he was struck on the head with a lead rod. Falling onto the rain-soaked ground, he covered his face with his hands, but the blows kept coming one after another. He started wheezing. His eyes, filled with blood, could no longer see the leaden sky. And Vasiliev watched and waited until the man grew quiet. Then he got into the car and patted the steering wheel. In the glove compartment he found the money, Vyacheslav's earnings for the evening's work. Not much, but at least he didn't have to sell anything to the dealers. Vasiliev grumbled discontentedly, counted the money and grunted. He got out of the car and dragged the body under a sprawling spruce tree. A minute later the engine roared and the car sped away. A week later, 4 missing persons reports were filed with the police. They all worked as taxi drivers in their own cars and disappeared without a trace. The cars were later found. They had been abandoned in different parts of the city. In the car interiors, investigators found the missing persons' documents and in some dried traces of blood. Someone brutally dealt with the drivers, then drove around in the cars and later abandoned them in different parts of the city. Soon, passers-by discovered another driver's body with gunshot wounds. They were shot with a hunting rifle. The body was disfigured, the face mutilated by blows from a heavy object. The injuries were very similar to those suffered by the victims of the apartment attacks. It became clear that the criminal was not just an ordinary robber. This is a clever and cunning sadist, ready to deal with his victims even for a small gain. He left them no chance to survive so that no one could identify him. All the incidents were combined into one case. The investigation was taken over by Vyacheslav Muravyev. In the early 2000s, he worked as a senior detective at the main directorate of internal affairs for the Krasnoyarsk region. But no matter how hard the detectives tried, the criminal was elusive and continued his rampage. In a small apartment on the outskirts of Krasnoyarsk, the light stayed on until morning. Vasiliev sat on a stool and looked at his companion with displeasure. 28-year-old Nikolai Temnerenko was younger than him, still inexperienced and timid. Vasiliev met him when he was renting an apartment from his mother. They were similar both in their fates and in their characters. Nikolai served time in prison for his live-in partner, in the sense that he got jealous of her and beat her to death with a stone on a deserted beach. He was released recently, And he really needed, I'm telling you, do the right thing. You can always find money, food, and all sorts of useless stuff at summer cottages, Vasiliev told his accomplice, looking him straight in the eye, trying to persuade him. Nikolai smirked. He liked taking other people's things, but what about witnesses? But dead men don't talk, Vasiliev winked at him. He had a sawed-off shotgun and a hammer, and a car too. Drive around the villages and take whatever you want. Nikolai leaned back in his chair and smiled. But there's no phone. No one will come if you do it quickly, he concluded. Vasiliev finally breathed a sigh of relief to himself. He'd convinced this fool. I have a couple more buddies in mind, Nikolai said, squinting. They like freebies too, not squeamish? Vasiliev smiled warmly, as if inviting friends to a card game. Let them come tomorrow, we'll discuss everything. In the summer of 2000, a wave of brutal attacks swept through the dacha settlements of Krasnoyarsk. Unknown assailants attacked houses standing in remote areas and mercilessly dealt with the owners. They took anything that was even slightly valuable. They didn't leave anyone alive, only corpses. The unfortunate ones were beaten to death with hammers, shot, and less often stabbed with knives. Based on the traces left at the crime scene, the investigators determined and agreed that there were at least 2 attackers. Vyacheslav Muravyev's investigative team went out several times a month. Everywhere the scene was the same: bodies, blood, scattered belongings. Krasnoyarsk budarazhilo. The newspapers were all reporting about a daring gang of thugs operating in the summer cottage communities. The outskirts of Krasnoyarsk. Late evening, Vasiliev silently watched as the 2 accomplices, hardened criminals, examined the belongings of the summer residents, scattering piles of old rags. In the corner, an elderly man with a bloodied head and gunshot wounds in his legs groaned. The partners exchanged glances. Vasiliev shouted, "I'll do it myself," and walked over to the man. The man lifted his head and reached out his hand, shielding himself. Vasiliev slowly took a lead rod out of his coat pocket. He stood for a second, aiming and grimacing. Then he struck him on the head with a powerful swing. There was a crunch and a dying scream. Vasiliev struck again to make sure. "Hey, Sanya, there's nothing to take here except food." The youngest of the accomplices, Kostik, stood up and gave Vasiliev a nasty look. He had complained before. The loot really was meager. They didn't find any antiques. Old rags, food supplies, sometimes power tools. At best, a little money and some cheap women's jewelry. That's not the kind of riches Vasiliev promised them. He glanced silently at Nikolai Temnerenko. He silently walked over to the cabinet, checking if there was a stash. Old mugs, plates, and worn tin spoons fell to the floor. "Kolyan, do you think so too?" he asked quietly. For some reason, he stuck his hand into the carpet. Nikolai shook his head. "There are plenty of houses, if not here, then somewhere else we'll find one," he said, kicking an old mug with his foot. Vasiliev nodded approvingly and pulled a sawed-off shotgun out of his pocket. "Hey, Kostik, how much do you weigh?" Kostik froze, staring fearfully at the weapon pointed at him. "What? It'll be hard to carry you," the leader grinned broadly. He fired a double shot from the sword off at him. Kostik was thrown back toward the couch. He flopped down and immediately went quiet. Vasiliev reloaded slowly. "He sure was a restless one," he said to Nikolai. "Take his share for yourself and help me pull him out." Nikolai obediently grabbed his partner's body and dragged it toward the door. They took Kostik's body in the trunk of a recently stolen car and dumped it in the Yenisei River. This wasn't the first time Vasiliev punished his subordinates. A week earlier, he had shot another one. That one turned out to be too slow and talkative, and he also didn't understand why it was necessary to get rid of all the witnesses. Vasiliev buried his body outside the city. He and Temnerenko soon parted ways, and each went down his own crooked path. Summer of 2000. The suburbs of Krasnoyarsk. Late in the evening, a woman was standing alone at the bus stop. She was a bit tipsy, coming back from visiting friends, and was running late. A car stopped next to her, and a friendly man asked where she needed to go. She gave him the address, and he said he would give her a ride for free. The attractive passenger was open to getting to know him, and the driver suggested they spend some time alone in the nearby woods. But to do it for free, she didn't want to. He offered 300 rubles, and that suited her. After their intimate encounter, the passenger demanded the money. The driver refused, saying that he was already giving her a ride for free. Angry at being deceived, the woman threatened to file a report accusing him of rape. That sealed her fate. Aleksandr Vasiliev, who was the one driving the car, dragged the unfortunate woman to the roadside and beat her to death with the same pig iron. He hid the body in the nearest dense spruce forest using a metal rod. He didn't forget to take off her gold ring and earrings as well. On September 19, 36-year-old Lyubov Belemestnik was waiting for a buyer for a baby stroller. The doorbell rang, and on the doorstep she saw a well-dressed man with a pleasant appearance. She let him in without hesitation and went to the room where the stroller was. Approaching her from behind, Vasiliev silently pulled out his rod and struck the woman on the head with full force. After she fell, he struck 3 more times to make sure. That day, he took a small amount of money, some jewelry, and food from the refrigerator. The family was not wealthy, which is why they were selling old children's things. When she came home from school, the daughter found her mother's lifeless body in a pool of blood, and once again, the police. Investigation, questioning of neighbors and witnesses. Once again, the local newspapers are full of headlines. The classified ad maniac is back, be careful. Panic is growing in the city, and people are afraid to post ads. Taxi drivers keep crowbars by their seats and scrutinize their passengers carefully. It's impossible to get out of the city by taxi, even for double the fare. No matter how long the rope twists, it always comes to an end. In this case, the end came unexpectedly and foolishly, Detective Vyacheslav Muravyov recalls. A call came in from the police department in Solnechny. A drunk driver was detained. He crashed into a pole, and when the traffic police arrived at the scene, he was sleeping behind the wheel. He was very drunk, and in his Zhiguli they found a shovel with fresh soil on it and a sawed-off shotgun. The car itself turned out to be stolen. Wiped bloodstains were found on the seats. The car belonged to a man who had disappeared without a trace the day before. The driver had documents in the name of Aleksandr Nikolaevich Vasilyev. An investigation began. The investigative team included, in addition to Muravyev, Konstantin Dolganov and Alexei Ovsyannikov. Vyacheslav Muravyev recalls, "On the first day, we worked on this for 12 hours. We searched Vasilyev's house and found a lot of women's belongings there. Of course, we suspected something was wrong. At first, Vasilyev said that he had taken the life of a taxi driver whose car he had taken. He showed us the place where he buried the body. And then he voluntarily agreed to cooperate with the investigation, but on one condition. A police general and a journalist must be present at the first interrogation. We dressed up the local judge as the general, and there was no shortage of journalists anyway. We invited Elena Evgenievna Penzina, who was well known in Krasnoyarsk, the host of Prima TV, says Vyacheslav Muravyov. At this interrogation, he confessed that he was the Black Angel and asked to be called that. He willingly talked to me, saying that he has an important and serious mission on Earth. What kind of mission? To eliminate all weak and unnecessary people so that the all-powerful can live and prosper. During the investigation, Vasilyev spoke about more than 30 crimes with 17 victims. He spoke with particular pride and in minute detail, as if enjoying his own cruelty and cynicism. Yes, he achieved the fame he had dreamed of, at the cost of innocent people's lives. He told how, during a tourist trip to Recreation Island through connections, he was with a girl. And when he wanted to take things further, she rejected him. Him? How dare she? Unable to accept the rejection, Vasilyev waited until they were alone and smashed her head with a stone. He wanted to sexually assault the girl while she was still alive, but he didn't like the sight of blood on her head. So he left the victim to die among the rocks and trees in the grove on the island. These had nothing to do with any material gain. So, in the fall of 2000, passed a dacha plot where an elderly man was digging up potatoes in the field. He stopped, picked up a hefty tree branch, then sneaked up behind the pensioner and beat him to death. He got on the Ural motorcycle that belonged to the victim, rode it to the city, and abandoned it. Why did he do that? He just felt like it. Why not? He told the story about the incident at the bus stop with particular pride. That rainy evening, he met a tipsy man who had come home from a birthday party. They started talking, and Vasiliev gained his trust so much that the tipsy new acquaintance invited him over to his place. They sat at the table, drank, had some snacks, and then the considerably drunk host went to bed. Vasiliev took his rod out of his coat pocket and struck the sleeping man several times. Then he calmly searched the apartment, took more than 6,000 rubles and valuable jewelry, and left, pleased with the chance encounter. There was also a case on his list when he came to an old lady in response to an advertisement. As they talked, he learned that she had no relatives and was selling her old things out of necessity. However, this didn't bother him at all. On the contrary, he even brightened up. If the old lady was alone, then no one would miss her. He used the lead rod, one blow was enough. After that, he went to the kitchen and started eating a modest dinner. That's how he spent several days next to the corpse until the food in the fridge ran out and there was nothing left to take from the apartment. He felt neither remorse nor pangs of conscience, and I can recall the details of his actions. The newspaper wrote that the maniac also left notes at the crime scenes, in which he called himself the Black Angel. They were supposedly made from letters cut out of magazines and newspapers. Vyacheslav Muravyev recalls, some newspapers at the time wrote that at the crime scenes he left notes with letters cut out from newspapers saying, "It's bad to be rich," and signed Black Angel. He didn't leave any notes at the crime scenes, despite what the media wrote. He came up with the nickname Black Angel during our interrogations. He wasn't a maniac at all. He committed all his crimes out of selfish motives. No mental disorders were found in him, but he wanted attention. That's why at some point he started talking about the Superman theory, saying he was eliminating those who didn't deserve to live. He also made up a mystical story about his capture, claiming that after an accident he was operated on, and under anesthesia he started confessing to his crimes and saying that he was the Black Angel of Darkness. He came to Earth to cleanse it. That was also made up by journalists chasing after sensationalism and other hype. However, Vasiliev did not forget about his own comfort in the detention center. There were cases when, in exchange for revealing new episodes, he asked investigators for expensive meals, cigarettes, and fashionable clothes. Sometimes, in order to solve a crime, the operatives would meet his demands. Cooperating with the investigation ruled out a life sentence for him, and he took advantage of this for his own purposes. Investigator for major cases with the Krasnoyarsk prosecutor's office, Davel Kartavsky, said that Vasiliev had an incredible memory. He described his crimes in every detail, recalls Davel. If there was something to hide, he would have hidden it. He had an idea in his head to commit as many as possible and then tell about it. At first it was hard to tell what was true and what was fiction, but he pointed everything out very accurately. Where the body was, where the car was, for example, the stolen one, and where he hid the body. During interrogations, Vasiliev behaved calmly. In front of the investigators sat a sociable, educated man who spoke curiously about the devil and God. He easily gave up his only surviving accomplice, Nikolai Temnerenko. Later, he would receive 17 years in a strict regime penal colony. It was also decided to recover 60,000 rubles from him in favor of the victims. Vasiliev did not hesitate to take on others' sins too. Understanding that he would not get a life sentence, he offered to take the blame for his cellmates' crimes for payment. One more, one less. What difference does it make? The death penalty was abolished. According to Muravyev, he wanted to claim at least 2 such crimes as his own. But he quickly broke down. He tried to keep the attention on himself, even going so far as to take the blame for things he didn't do. For a while people wrote about him, and even a film crew came to the detention center. All this allowed him to serve his sentence with much more comfort, indulging his twisted ego. According to the results of the psychological and psychiatric examination, Aleksandr Vasiliev was found to be sane and fully aware of his actions, although some mental abnormalities were found, which is why he was granted leniency. He hated people and wanted as many deaths as possible. In scientific terms, he was a homicidal maniac. He wanted people to talk and write about him afterward, especially many of his longtime acquaintances. They describe him as quite normal and friendly. They say they used to sit together and have drinks. No aggression or abnormal behavior. He just loved himself a lot. To brag, to show off. But we never thought he was capable of such horrors. All of Krasnoyarsk was eagerly awaiting the verdict for the Black Angel. Everyone thought the serial killer would get a life sentence. But taking his confession into account, and his willing cooperation with the investigation, by law, the judge could not give more than 3/4 of the maximum sentence provided by this article. The Krasnoyarsk Krai prosecutor's office also demanded that the court sentence Vasiliev to life imprisonment. However, on November 5, 2002, the Krasnoyarsk Regional Court sentenced him to 25 years in prison. He was also ordered to pay more than 300,000 rubles to the victims' relatives. Vasilyev repeatedly filed complaints requesting a reduction of his sentence. On November 5, 2011, the Krasnoyarsk Regional Court, after reviewing Vasiliev's appeal, reduced his sentence to 22.5 years in a high-security prison. By a resolution of the Presidium of the Krasnoyarsk Regional Court on April 17, 2002, the sentence was reduced to 21 years and 10 months of imprisonment. And on September 27, 2013, the Sverdlovsk District Court of Krasnoyarsk reduced the sentence to 20 years. Vasiliev invoked Article 61 of the Criminal Code, referring to the fact that he had written a confession and assisted in solving the crimes. But human judgment was followed by another kind of judgment. In general, Aleksandr Vasiliev is a person with an initially weak sense of self-worth, which he tried to compensate for all his life through outward appearances. In his childhood and teenage years, Aleksandr Vasiliev did not have stable recognition either among his peers or in his family, and so he developed the habit early on of building himself up with words, inventions, exaggerations, and images. For him, it was more important to seem than to be. At the same time, he didn't have the inner resources that could support this image with real achievements. When those around him exposed or rejected him, it didn't lead to self-reflection, but only increased his inner tension. In such cases, a person often develops defensive attitudes. The problem isn't with me, the problem is with everyone else. Gradually, this turns into a persistent contempt for people and a feeling that the world has underestimated him. The experience of prison had a strong influence. There he found himself in a position of complete social downfall and humiliation. For a psyche with already damaged self-esteem, this is not just bullying, but a point after which a person may completely give up trying to be normal and switch to the logic of compensation through power. A mindset takes shape. If I was humiliated, I will be the one who humiliates others. After being released, he doesn't try to fit into society, but continues to look for ways to prove his own significance. At the same time, he develops a simple and convenient system of justifications, the idea that he has the right to do more than others. This is not a deep conviction most likely, but rather a tool that allows him not to feel internal conflict. Another important feature, he doesn't have a stable emotional connection. He can appear outwardly friendly, talkative, even charming, but this is more of a social mask. To him, people had no value as individuals. Essentially, he saw them as objects, a source of money, convenience, or situations. This explains why he can easily switch from normal communication to violence without any internal restraint. A distinct desire for control also emerges. It's important for him not just to gain an advantage, but to manage the situation, to decide what will happen to the other person. This gives him a sense of power that he didn't have in his ordinary life. That's why his actions aren't just about self-interest. There's an element of dominance and demonstration of superiority in them. At the same time, he doesn't lose his rationality. He knows how to adapt, change his behavior, and avoid unnecessary risk. This is not a chaotic person, but someone who is able to plan and adjust his actions. But this rationality serves distorted goals. After his capture, his behavior shows another key trait: dependence on attention. He strives to be at the center of what's happening, to control how he is perceived, to create a certain image of himself. Even in a situation where most people would try to disappear and minimize attention, he does the opposite. He amplifies his presence. As a result, his psychology is built around three basic mechanisms: constant compensation for inner inferiority through an image of significance, devaluing others to the level of mere tools, and striving for control and attention as a way to feel powerful. This doesn't make him impulsive, but rather persistently warped towards self-assertion at any cost. So, at the beginning of 2017, Vasiliev was diagnosed with cancer, a malignant tumor of the left kidney with metastases in the liver and lungs. He underwent surgery, having his kidney and spleen removed, and was then given permanent Group 1 disability status. On November 21, 2017, the Krasnoyarsk Regional Court decided to release Vasiliev from custody due to his serious illness. In total, he spent only 16 years behind bars for 17 lives taken and 30 crimes committed. So, the Black Angel ended up among the people of Krasnoyarsk once again, and now comes the most interesting part. The documents from the Federal Penitentiary Service state that while he was in the colony, he did not maintain any social connections, he didn't correspond with relatives or friends, they didn't call him, and they didn't visit him. He didn't receive any parcels or packages. And when he was released, no one met him at the gates of the colony. The house where he was registered, a 2-story barrack, was declared unsafe in 2019 and demolished. The residents received new apartments, but there is no information about where exactly. According to the documents, Vasiliev, after his release, ended up at the Krasnoyarsk Center for Social Adaptation of Persons Released from Places of Imprisonment. Here, former convicts can live for up to 6 months. Each person has a bed, and they are provided with a one-time hot meal consisting of 2 dishes. A resident can use the washing machine and shower. During the 6 months, they try to help the resident find a job and housing. This doesn't always work out, because most of the people who end up here are in extremely poor shape socially and medically. None of the current residents of the center remember Vasiliev. The center director hasn't seen him either. But as it turned out, there was no one to remember. Vasiliev never spent the night here, not even once. He came to us to register on December 22, 2017, says a center employee. We helped him. The registration was issued for 6 months. He didn't come back after that. But Vasiliev lived for another 2 years, and he lived large. How is that possible with his illness? Oncologists usually explain this by saying that it's not always possible to predict the course of the disease. Sometimes remission occurs for a certain period. Of course, care and quality of life are very important. But the disability pension is not very large. You can't live large on it. Aleksandr Vasiliev was not just living out his days somewhere. With each passing day, at the beginning of 2019, according to the documents, he bought an Opel car. And he did it without taking out a loan. There are no enforcement proceedings against them. The maniac was well dressed, as shown in the photos and videos. Yes, 59-year-old Aleksandr Vasiliev registered on YouTube, created his own channel where he posted videos about his carefree life. In them, he looks quite decent, filming himself on his mobile phone. As a reminder, I share extra materials on Telegram. A 3-minute segment. By the way, it also had to be edited. It's pure self-admiration. Against the backdrop of shops, expensive restaurants, and parks. People who appear in the frame, including children, look curiously at the man in a white t-shirt, white headphones, and black glasses. Meet him. If only they knew how many unfortunate people he had sent to their deaths. Vasiliev seemed to do his best to document his life while he was free. Here he is in a fur hat next to the glowing lights of Christmas trees in winter. Here he is in a light cap by flower beds in summer. Well, in the dancing, flashing lights, the maniac is a whole different story. And all of this is not only on YouTube, but also on TikTok. And he had followers. People liked his posts. By the way, give me likes too. I could use them, and I even need them. Someone might say he's done his time. He has the right to live and share his life. And actually, yes, but this is a rather surprising case when a former inmate's first thing is to start filming and running a YouTube and TikTok channel instead of doing something else and less public. And I also remembered the words of those who saw him right after his arrest. Among them was a former journalist and now a State Duma deputy from Krasnoyarsk, Elena Penzina, who was asked to help by law enforcement officers. If you remember, Vasiliev agreed to testify only in the presence of a general and with a reporter from a federal TV channel present. According to her, he was posing, he was very concerned about how he would look, and it was very noticeable throughout the entire interview because he kept trying to adjust his posture, look at himself, a kind of showmanship. It was very important to him how he would be judged, so it turns out that years in prison didn't change Vasiliev. But it's showmanship, not a crime. But something else might be a crime. Officially, the Black Angel never worked or was employed anywhere. It's hard to imagine that he was working illegal odd jobs somewhere. After all, he was seriously ill, so physically he probably wouldn't have been able to unload trucks or clean up the area. And working in an office was out of the question for him. Former convicts aren't accepted there. So then the question is, who supported him? It's possible, of course, that he found a kind-hearted woman who decided to take him in, clothe him, and provide for him. But could he have done it not just quickly, but almost instantly? After all, he hadn't spent a single day in that center. And then it's unclear what he was living on at all. And the first thing that comes to mind is stashes he left before he was detained. But the investigation has repeatedly proven that he didn't amass countless treasures through his crimes, and he spent what he stole right away, never denying himself anything. And second, he exclaimed, "It's stary spособ." Remember, during one of his first robberies he killed an elderly woman. And then he lived in that apartment for 3 days, took food from her fridge, slept on the couch where she used to watch TV. That is, he acted completely calmly in the apartment with the corpse. And after being detained, he cynically and casually said that at that moment he realized he needed to get rid of the victims so they wouldn't scream, and he had time to change his mind, and he made himself at home in the apartment. Journalists in Krasnoyarsk tried to find people who might have crossed paths with Vasiliev, but there were no traces. And in theory, this could only happen when the beast, having caught its prey, lay low in its lair. How many lonely old women are there in Krasnoyarsk? A lot. And this can easily explain where he gets the money for expensive clothes, gadgets, cars, and a carefree life. Yelena Penzina, remembering him, calls him a monster. He has, as people say, some kind of animal energy. When you're near him, you realize that he's dangerous. He has completely empty eyes, the eyes of a wild beast. I remember what he said, how he stalked. He would walk past the post office around the time when pensions were being handed out. He calmly watched the person, observed who they met, who they talked to. By some kind of inner instinct he understood that the person was lonely. I was left with mixed feelings. On one hand, it seemed to me that he needed treatment. On the other hand, he was very experienced and calculating, that is, he prepared these crimes in advance. He thought through how to sell the stolen goods without getting caught, and he covered his tracks masterfully. If administrative supervision had been established over Vasilyev, at least we could have figured out which area he lived in. But no. The Federal Penitentiary Service blames the police, and the police blame the Federal Penitentiary Service. In fact, no one was supervising the maniac who had neither social connections nor a job. No one was interested in his fate. He absolutely should have been under close watch by law enforcement because, well, you understand, but that didn't happen. Vasilyev died on January 28, 2020. They say no one visits his grave, forgotten by everyone. But who knows, maybe in a year or two new crimes committed by the maniac TikToker after his release will come to light and there will be no one left to answer for them. And what do you think about this case? Leave your comments, share the video, like or dislike, check out additional materials on Telegram and watch other videos on the channel. They do come out even though you don't always get notifications about it.